There are wars that stay inside borders. And then there are wars that begin in one country but slowly start exposing how fragile the entire world has become. This is one of those wars. Because what is happening now is no longer just a campaign against Iran. It is no longer only about missiles, airstrikes, or retaliation. It is about whether the global system can keep functioning when one regional war begins to squeeze the world's energy arteries, divide allies, rattle financial markets, and force governments from Brussels to Tokyo to rethink what comes next. By the standards of modern warfare, the military phase is already immense. The U.S. military says Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, and by March 16th had already struck more than 7,000 targets, flown more than 6,500 combat sorties, and damaged or destroyed more than 100 Iranian vessels. Those are not symbolic strikes. That is a campaign built to break military capacity at scale. And yet, even after that level of force, the war is not finished. That matters, because if thousands of targets can be hit, naval assets can be degraded, and air power can dominate the battlefield, but the conflict still keeps escalating, then the real issue was never just destruction. The real issue is leverage. And Iran still has leverage. Not because it can defeat the United States in a conventional war, not because it can occupy territory, but because it can still threaten the one place where military pressure becomes global economic pressure: the Strait of Hormuz. The strait normally carries about 1/5 of the world's oil, and recent reporting says the current war has nearly halted normal maritime traffic there, even as some ships and some Iranian oil exports continue to get through. That is the point many people still miss. Iran does not need to win the war in the old sense. It only needs to keep Hormuz unstable enough that everyone else starts paying the cost. And once that happens, the war stops being a Middle East story and becomes a world story. That transformation is already happening. After Iranian attacks on major Gulf energy infrastructure, including Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility and refineries in Kuwait, Brent crude rose toward $114 per barrel, and Europe's benchmark natural gas price jumped sharply. Markets fell across Asia and Europe, and even central banks began explicitly pointing to the war as a destabilizing force. That means the battlefield now reaches into inflation, interest rates, industrial costs, shipping, insurance, and consumer prices far beyond the Gulf. This is where the war becomes strategically more important than its maps suggest. In the 20th century, a war became global when armies crossed continents. In the 21st century, a war can become global when energy terminals burn, shipping lanes freeze, allies disagree, and markets panic, even if no one captures a capital city. The modern world runs on flows: oil, gas, cargo, credit, data, and confidence. Hormuz sits across one of those flows like a hand around a throat. That is also why the political response has been so uneven. Europe is clearly worried, but not eager to fight. At the European Council this week, leaders focused heavily on rising oil and gas prices, economic shock, and the risk of wider instability. AP reports that many EU leaders have resisted U.S. pressure to send military assets to secure Hormuz, and several European leaders have made clear that this is not a war they intend to join directly. That tells us something very important. Even Washington's allies do not see this as a war with a clean, controllable end state. Asia sees the same danger from a different angle. Japan, which depends heavily on Middle Eastern energy, has said it has no current plan to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz and is emphasizing de-escalation. That response is revealing. It shows that even key U.S. partners are trying to protect energy security without getting drawn into direct military participation. The more this conflict threatens shipping and fuel costs, the more countries will try to stay economically engaged while remaining militarily cautious. So, if this war is already reshaping energy and alliance politics, what comes next? That depends on what kind of victory Washington is actually seeking. If the goal were regime change through occupation, this war would need to become much bigger, much bloodier, and much longer. But the signals so far point somewhere else. They suggest a narrower but still dangerous objective: break Iran's ability to threaten regional shipping, degrade the systems that sustain that threat, and restore enough security around Hormuz that the global economy can breathe again. That reading fits both the U.S. campaign pattern described by CENTCOM and the intense focus in current reporting on reopening or securing the strait rather than conquering Iran itself. That leads to the most likely short-term future. The first scenario, and probably the base case over the next several weeks, is a prolonged air and maritime war without a full-scale ground invasion. In that scenario, the U.S. and its partners keep pounding missile sites, naval infrastructure, drones, and command networks, while trying to slowly reduce the threat to shipping without crossing into a massive land occupation. Oil stays high, shipping remains risky, and the war becomes a grinding contest over endurance, cost, and uncertainty rather than territory. That scenario is supported by the current pattern: heavy air operations, severe disruption in Hormuz, and allied reluctance to escalate into another major ground war. The second scenario is limited escalation. Not a march to Tehran, but a move against key islands, coastal nodes, or maritime launch points tied to the Strait of Hormuz. Reporting from the Wall Street Journal says military planners are considering how U.S. Marines could help reopen the waterway, including possible action involving strategically located Iranian islands. If that happens, the war would enter a new phase. Still not a classic occupation of Iran, but no longer a conflict fought only from a distance. It would be a controlled expansion designed to remove specific choke point threats while stopping short of a full invasion. The third scenario is the most dangerous: an expanding energy war. If Iran continues hitting Gulf energy infrastructure, and if counterstrikes keep widening the target set, the war could shift from military suppression into mutual economic sabotage. That would mean prolonged damage to production, more severe tanker disruption, higher inflation, and rising pressure on governments already struggling with growth and energy costs. Europe is already scrambling to contain the shock, and Asian markets have already reacted sharply. If this scenario hardens, the war's most powerful weapon may no longer be missiles alone, but the economic chain reaction they trigger. There is also a political consequence that may prove just as important as the military one. Every extra week of this war tests the cohesion of the Western alliance. The United States wants support. Europe wants distance. Asian partners want stability. Energy importers want transit restored. And countries like China can continue benefiting from discounted flows and geopolitical hesitation without taking on the burden of direct intervention. The longer the war lasts, the more it exposes that today's international order is not unified. It is fragmented, transactional, and deeply risk-averse. That is one reason this conflict matters so much beyond the battlefield. So no, the biggest question is no longer simply, will the United States invade Iran? That question is too narrow now. The more important question is this: can the United States reduce Iran's leverage over Hormuz fast enough to calm the global system before the economic consequences of the war become more destabilizing than the military threat itself? Because that is what this conflict has become: a race between military suppression and systemic shock. A test of whether air power can destroy enough capability to restore order before energy disruption, political hesitation, and regional escalation create a much larger crisis. And that is why this war matters. Not only because people are dying, not only because cities and military sites are being hit, but because this conflict reveals how the modern world can be shaken without a single army conquering a single capital. A choke point closes, energy prices surge, allies hesitate, markets recoil, and suddenly a war that began in one region starts rewriting the calculations of the entire planet. In the end, Iran may or may not be invaded in the old sense, but that is no longer the only measure of how large this war has become. Because when a conflict can disrupt 1/5 of the world's oil flow, force Europe into emergency energy thinking, shake Asian markets, and push military planners to consider new ways of reopening the world's most sensitive waterway, then this is no longer only a war about Iran. It is a war about pressure points, a war about control, and above all, a war about how little disruption the modern world can absorb before the entire system begins to bend.